Welcome back to the Now Morning Show. It's just about 33 minutes after the hour of 7 o'clock on this Monday morning. I'm Kimberly D'Souza. Now, we've often heard that domestic violence has a cyclical pattern of behavior where children who witnessed abuse may express certain tendencies when they get older. And to speak to us more about this topic is the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, Mr. Charles JP Collier. Mr. Collier, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Thank you especially, actually, for having this sort of extended, in-depth address of this issue. I really, really appreciate that.
And we appreciate actually you coming to talk to us about this, because we've been hearing that, hurt people hurt people. And so I was wondering, children who witness domestic violence at a young age, what sort of tendencies will they normally begin to exhibit? And we can also look at it short term and long term.
Okay, so I often steer away from the word witness. I prefer exposed to domestic violence. Reason being that witness tends to suggest that we're talking about visual perception, visual awareness of the domestic violence. They're there and they see it happen, but often that's not the case. In many instances, what happens is that children, first and foremost, hear domestic violence. The inspector who was on earlier addressed the fact that violence occurs in a number of ways. It's not just physical violence. It can also be verbal. It can be emotional. It can be sexual. It can be financial. And so the first awareness of violence may not be an awareness of physical violence. Children may be exposed to the sound of their parents in a loud argument. They may be exposed to hearing one or the other parent or both address each other using language that is not appropriate. They may hear the sounds of physical scuffling or fighting. They may hear the sounds of blows being delivered or things breaking in the house at night. That may be out of view, but that may be their exposure. And in fact, that's much more likely than seeing the physical violence, because physical violence occurs far less frequently than non-physical forms of violence, such as controlling and manipulative behavior, verbal abuse, other kinds of emotional abuse, financial abuse. Those things occur much more frequently than physical violence, and the children may be aware of that first and foremost. And so I prefer to use, therefore, the term exposure to domestic violence. The second thing is that the ways in which children are affected are numerous. They may be confused by what they're hearing. They are almost certainly likely to be afraid. They are, depending on how intense the violence is, depending on how involved it is, how frequent it is, children may find themselves becoming involved. I've worked with a lot of adults who report the experience of intervening in violence between their parents when they were children. And so it's well beyond just visual witnessing. They may become participants in a violent affair.
Now, Mr. Collier, I want to bring in, as we are on the topic, I want to also bring in the ages of the children. So, for example, for a child who experienced or was exposed to domestic violence at the age of 5 versus a teenager who is exposed to it at the age of 16, will it differ in terms of how it affects them and how it actually affects their development?
It can. It depends. It's very variable. One of the issues about domestic violence, one of the reasons that I'm glad that you've had so many different stakeholders on this morning, is it is extremely complicated. And at any given point in time, there's a wide array of possibilities. And so in my experience, work that I've done and research that I've done, we've encountered children who were 2, 3 years old who were aware of the violence between their parents and had questions about it. They were confused about what was happening and had questions about it. The older children are much more likely to have some clarity about what's happening, partly because they are more developed cognitively, but partly because they may have been exposed to it for a long time. And so they may have seen this going on with their parents, heard it going on with their parents since they were very small. And, you know, some of the teenagers that I've worked with have a certain sort of cavalier response. They joke about the violence as a way of coping with it. When it happens at a very young age, if it's pervasive, meaning if it occurs frequently, if it's inescapable, it can have severe and significant effects on children's development. If a child is traumatized at an early age, it can arrest different parts of their development, including important parts of their emotional and psychological development.
Now, Mr. Collier, how do we move past this then? Because we only have a few minutes and I want to get in so much, but how do we, allow these children to get back on the path of, developing cognitively, developing socially? How do we get them there? Is it as simple as saying, use therapy?
Who has access to therapy, though? One of the issues is that we don't have a good national program that makes access to an address of these issues for children widely available. And so, in all likelihood, people who have access to therapy are privileged in a certain sense. And so, one of the issues is that if we're talking about our children recovering from and healing from their exposure to domestic violence, then we have to have systems in place. We need to have resources in place in our communities, in our national system of address of domestic violence. That has to be an intentional and well-resourced part of our program.
Now, in the absence of therapy, Mr. Collier, is then the response to it bringing these types of resources in school? Because I'm wondering what part education has to play with all of this.
When you say education, you mean the formal educational system.
Yes.
And that is an avenue. It is technically possible to provide support, training, education, specifically about the practice of nonviolence in relationships in schools. There are programs that have been developed for that purpose that can be adapted and implemented. I think there have been efforts to introduce that before, but we may not have been quite ready at a national level to face that. Part of our struggle is that, we're talking about victims of domestic violence, witnesses of domestic violence, perpetrators of domestic violence. What we're not talking about is the fact that this is a national societal issue. It's not just the individuals who end up in the news because somebody has been injured or killed. That those are the tip of the iceberg. They're horrifying instances and circumstances, but there are a lot of things that lead to and facilitate those individual events occurring. And so there's a need for us as a society to assess what we are doing. What are we doing that is lending room for the perpetration of domestic violence? What are we doing that facilitates that? What are our cultural scripts and practices and beliefs that allow that? So, for example, people will say things like, that's husband and wife business. And so there is a hands-off kind of policy with the address of domestic violence. And there's a need for a national conversation. There's a need for national engagement, which I'm going to circle back. You asked about education, and you were talking about a formal educational system for children.
Yes.
But I think that there's a need for an educational system for us as a nation. I think that there needs to be a widespread program of public education about domestic violence, because it's very difficult. Well, let me put it this way. If we think of this in terms of what we do with the children and not what we as adults, as a nation, do, then we place the burden of this incredibly difficult problem on children.
Mr. Collier, finally, I mean, as we look forward to addressing this problem with children, I mean, I know you mentioned the lack of resources available in terms of therapy, but how else can we, I mean, protect our children from these instances of, you know, this exposure to domestic violence?
That's exactly why I'm talking about public education, because there has to be a change in our perspective, our view, and our response as a society. If as a society we don't respond to domestic violence, then as a society we leave children to be exposed to it. And so there has to be a shift that occurs in terms of our national consciousness, awareness, and understanding of domestic violence. Our attitudes and beliefs and response to it have to shift in order to protect our children. We can't protect them independently of our own change as a society.
Mr. Collier, as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Now Morning Show. I know we've just scratched the surface, but as these things happen, we will be having you back again just to continue to have these conversations. So thank you for spending at least 10 to 15 minutes of your morning with us.
Thank you.
And that was Mr. Collier. Mr. Collier is the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, just sharing with us, you know, how we can help children who have been exposed to domestic violence incidences in the home. You're on the Now Morning Show. We're going to take a break and be right back. Stay with us.